Dude, this crowd would go nutty mode. They would lose their fucking minds, dude. They'd be like, "Whoa, whoa, I'm paying extra taxes this year." That's it. That's the truth. That's the fucking scary truth that many of y'all don't want to see. But he can't do that because he's a coward. Okay? Brave enough to talk about what else.
On December 1st, Mexico will get a new president. Former mayor of Mexico City, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, will take office. But his road to the presidency was anything but easy. López Obrador, also known as AMLO, first had to prevail over the incumbent Mexican administration, run by the PRI, a political party that has governed Mexico for most of the last century. After numerous corruption scandals and a failed war on
This is from 2018.
drugs that's killed almost 200,000 people since 2006, López Obrador was hoping the Mexican people were hungry for change. In this episode, we'll discuss how the political outsider AMLO rose to the highest office in Mexican politics. AMLO grew up in the state of Tabasco, the epicenter of Mexico's oil industry. His father worked in the industry and was able to provide AMLO with a middle-class childhood. AMLO became involved in politics and activism during his 20s, when he took a job as a representative of the National Indigenous Institute. While working there, he lived among the Chontal Maya, an indigenous population of Tabasco, who are some of Mexico's most impoverished people.
Now that we watch this, we'll watch another video that is not so hopeful 5 years after the fact as well.
AMLO lived and worked with them for 6 years, building the foundation for his political career while sleeping on a hammock in a dirt floor shack with his first wife, Rocio Beltran Medina. Eventually, AMLO continued his political work within the PRI's progressive wing. The party was pretty much Mexico's only game in town for ambitious young people looking to make a political impact. During his time in the PRI, AMLO represented the state of Tabasco in negotiations with state-run oil company Pemex, organizing local oil workers to demand higher wages and benefits from the company. In 1983, AMLO left the PRI, frustrated with the difficulty of making change from within Mexico's dominant political party. 5 years later, he joined the left-wing party of the Democratic Revolution. He ran for governor of Tabasco in 1988 and 1994. Both times ended in failure, but he persisted. In the 1990s, he organized actions like a 6-week march from Tabasco to Mexico City, which was meant to show support for free and fair elections, and blockades of oil facilities, which was to protest the industry's negative environmental impact on local farmers and fishermen. All this work on the front lines of activism raised AMLO's public profile in Mexico, and it eventually paid off. In 2000, AMLO finally won his first election, becoming mayor of Mexico City. During his tenure, AMLO's administration started providing stipends to senior citizens, built low-cost housing, subsidized subway fares, and opened new schools, including Mexico City's first state university. AMLO became overwhelmingly popular. He maintained an approval rating of over 70% throughout much of his 5-year term in office. This high approval rating made AMLO the frontrunner ahead of Mexico's 2006 presidential election. His platform during his 2006 run pledged to cut government salaries, as well as raise taxes on corporations and the wealthy, in order to pay for social programs that would help the Mexican people. AMLO ultimately lost the 2006 election by less than 0.6% of the vote. Nevertheless, he claimed victory on election night and demanded a recount. AMLO also accused winning candidate Felipe Calderón of orchestrating election fraud.
Les propongo que aquí nos quedemos, que permanezcamos aquí día y noche, hasta que se cuenten los votos y tengamos un presidente electo con la legalidad mínima que nos merecemos los mexicanos.
Mexico has a long history of election fraud, but the country instituted several reforms starting in the 1990s that eventually allowed for the PRI to be dislodged from power for the first time in 2000. After an election tribunal upheld the 2006 vote, AMLO still positioned himself as the, quote, legitimate president, and was inaugurated to a parallel government in Mexico City's Zócalo Square.
Se desconoce el cómputo oficial dado a conocer el día de hoy por el Tribunal Electoral del Poder Judicial de la Federación, que pretende...
The hand thing is apparently saluting the flag. It's a different... It's not... I personally also was like surprised by it. But... What do you mean, sure, bro? I mean, that's what the fucking Mexican chatters are saying. What do you want me to say to you? Also, I think the Hitler salute, like it is a version of the Roman salute, but the Hitler salute is done with the left hand.
Legalizar el fraude cometido el 2 de julio de 2006.
AMLO went on to name a resistance cabinet to run his parallel government that proposed legislation, issued statements, and even held its own elections. AMLO toured the country for the next several years, eventually visiting all of Mexico's 2,438 municipalities. Heading into the 2012 election with a larger public profile, AMLO decided to present a more...
Oh, Hitler salute is also with the right hand? Yeah, chat, chill. That's how us Mexicans salute the flag during our national anthem. It definitely does look problematic. Yeah, I mean, it does come from Roman origin. And fascists adopted it and was like, we're going to use this as like our thing. It's actually crazy how much of a fucking culture vulture Hitler was. This motherfucker looked at like the Germanic tribes and saw that they were living in mud huts and just basically literally stole shit from everybody. Like, what the fuck is the swastika? Like, what are we doing? What the fuck does that have to do with Germany? And even the fucking Roman salute. It's like, bitch, that's not your thing. That's why he was so invested in finding some like Nordic esoteric rune shit for Germany. Yeah. That's the worst part about Hitler is his cultural appropriation.
Moderate platform and image, even though he still referred to himself as the legitimate president as late as 2011. One addition to his platform for this election was a new approach to the war on drugs that then President Calderón had started upon entering office in 2006. AMLO proposed the removal of drug cartel fighting army troops from the streets, and said that the government's focus should instead be on tackling the root causes of crime and violence: lack of opportunity and Mexico's poor education.
No other Mexican politician has ever been as popular as López Obrador or AMLO. This is deeply ironic because the US government and the media outlets and opposition groups that it funds have claimed for years that AMLO is supposedly threatening Mexico's democracy. The National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, is a US government organization. It's basically a cutout of the CIA that was created supposedly to promote democracy in scare quotes, but in reality, it is used by Washington in order to meddle in the internal affairs of other countries. In the name of promoting democracy, it actually undermines democracy in order to support the interests of the US government and US corporations. And the NED published an article back in 2023 claiming how AMLO's Strongman Act is weakening Mexico. The media in Mexico has been spreading this ridiculous lie as well for years.
Damn, bro. This guy is the fucking... Okay, I perceive him as a threat now because honestly, he's fucking cooking everybody else. Okay? He's the #1 streamer. He's the #1 Mexican streamer. Okay, this changes everything.
Right-wing media outlets have said that AMLO is trying to install an authoritarian system. Right-wing elites in Mexico have been publishing articles in Spanish in the Washington Post and other US media outlets, claiming that Mexico is returning to the authoritarian era of the PRI. In 2020, the editorial board of the Financial Times, the major British newspaper, published an article titled López Obrador becomes Latin America's new strongman. The Mexican leader is revealing himself as an authoritarian populist. When they published this article, AMLO had about 67% support. Since then, it has increased to 80%. And why is AMLO so popular? It's very easy to explain. He is the first left-wing leader in decades in Mexico. He has significantly raised the minimum wage.
Stream.
A ver, vámonos con la combi. Desde el Estado de México.
And they're like, yo, excuse me, sir. What the fuck is going on here? You don't understand how much old heads love this man in Mexico? How is S-Fan so high? He only streams GTA and I see him at 10K viewers. Yeah, because he doesn't stop streaming. I can't match this content, dude. What the fuck? It's Jover. This guy's the top political streamer in NA. I was wrong.
He has reduced poverty. The economy has been growing significantly, and there are a lot of good industrial jobs coming to Mexico. Furthermore, he has been completely independent. He's basically the first Mexican leader in decades who's not a puppet of the United States. He has repeatedly criticized the U.S. for meddling in Mexico's internal affairs, for violating Mexican sovereignty. He has given powerful speeches telling the U.S., we are not a colony. We are not a protectorate of the U.S. Here is a clip of an...
Like, he is not as firmly up America's ass as like prior Mexican leadership, but that doesn't mean that he's still not lodged in there. Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, people take everything that people take things that politicians say in other countries, as long as they're like ostensibly left, for granted, unconditionally. That's my, anyway.
Incredible speech that AMLO gave in 2023 when he held a huge rally condemning the U.S. because many Republican politicians, including Donald Trump and his allies, have been threatening to invade Mexico. This was his powerful response, saying we are not a colony.
Pero lo más importante es que desde aquí, desde este zócalo, corazón político y cultural de México, le recordamos a esos políticos hipócritas e irresponsables que México es un país independiente y libre, no una colonia ni un protectorado de Estados Unidos.
Does it bother you you've been dethroned, or are you happy there are more popular lefty political commentators? Not a gotcha, genuinely curious about how you feel about it. AMLO could never do a 3-minute ad break at the top of the hour the way that I can. Can you imagine if he said, La hora, at the top of the hour? If he just popped off like that, if he segued right here in front of this crowd, they would go crazy. Es la cima de la hora. Dude, this crowd would go nutty mode. They would lose their fucking minds, dude. They'd be like, what? Well, I'm paying extra taxes this year. That's it. That's the truth. That's the fucking scary truth that many of y'all don't want to see. But he can't do that because he's a coward. Okay? Brave enough to talk about wood elves, not brave enough to serve the top of the hour ad break. Me, on the other hand, I serve that shit. Now, if you no longer want to see those ads, all you need to do is subscribe for $5 or for free with a Twitch Prime. What's your stance on wood elves? Whatever you want it to be. Here's the 3-minute ad break now.
AMLO has also reasserted sovereign control over Mexico's natural resources. Oil in Mexico had been nationalized as part of the Mexican Revolution going back to 1910 and the progressive constitution that was created. But the neoliberal right-wing US-backed leaders who governed Mexico in recent years before AMLO, they were gradually trying to privatize the oil in Mexico. When AMLO came back, he promised that he was going to undo the neoliberal free market fundamentalist policies. He renationalized oil, and under AMLO, Mexico nationalized its lithium, the new white gold that is needed for the green energy transition.
Y recientemente se nacionalizó el litio, mineral estratégico utilizado en la construcción de baterías para autos eléctricos y sistema de almacenamiento para las energías limpias. Me llena de orgullo poder recordar justicia social, igualdad, soberanía. ¡Viva la expropiación petrolera! ¡Vivan los trabajadores y técnicos de antes y de ahora de la industria petrolera nacional!
So he's a left.
Dude, his interpreter was going nutty mode. He was fucking feeling it. This video seems a little bit biased. No, it's incredibly biased. Even though the natural resource sovereignty part is real, actually. That is a real thing that he did, which is insane that there was any other question that it would not have happened, that it would be privatized to begin with, was ridiculous. But that part is actually the reason why I said from the jump that, you know, he's done some good shit.
Left-wing nationalist who has been reasserting control over Mexico's natural resources, defending Mexico's sovereignty, and the minimum wage has increased, living standards have increased, social programs have increased. It's very easy to explain why he's popular, but precisely because he is independent. He is not a U.S.
Bro, how come your support for politicians like AOC and Bernie isn't quite as critical as you feel about AMLO? What the fuck are you talking about? I do legitimately disagree with AOC and Bernie all the time, especially Bernie when it comes to Israel, for example. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? Brother, this video is not going to show you some of the more negative aspects of AMLO because it's, you know, understandably biased. Like, a lot of the shit that you would never even... If AOC personally did half the fucking shit that AMLO did when it comes to his like social policies, you would literally never vote for her or never advocate to even have her in question as a progressive. What the fuck are you talking about? You have to take the good and the bad. What do you mean? Like, he is very old, and I think ultimately his age and his like social conservatism plays a big role in possibly his popularity amongst older people in general, but also beyond that, and beyond that, he is like pretty socially conservative across the board.
Puppet. That's why the U.S. government
still better than prior Mexican leadership, but you know,
in the U.S. and oligarch-owned right-wing media outlets in Mexico, they have spread this false narrative claiming that he's authoritarian, despite the fact that he has 80% support, because the U.S. cannot control him, and the right-wing capitalist oligarchs in Mexico cannot control him. The Council on Foreign Relations, which is one of the most powerful think tanks in the U.S., closely linked to the U.S. State Department and also to Wall Street, the Council on Foreign Relations has also spread these lies, claiming that Mexico's democracy is crumbling under AMLO. The media arm of the Council on Foreign Relations is Foreign Affairs magazine. This is one of the most well-respected media outlets in the U.S., and it has repeatedly published articles by right-wing oligarchs, elites in Mexico who hate AMLO, like, for instance, Denise Dresser, and she published an article in Foreign Affairs claiming that Mexico's democracy is dying because of the authoritarian populism of AMLO. In an article this May, she published another article in Foreign Affairs claiming that people in Mexico are voting for autocracy because AMLO has undermined democracy and brought back party. What these US media outlets and oligarchs are trying to do is blatantly meddle in Mexico's internal affairs in the lead up to the election, which is on the 2nd of June. And every single poll has shown that AMLO's political ally, Claudia Sheinbaum, who is the former governor of Mexico City, and she is from the same left-wing party of President López Obrador, which is called Morena. And all of the polls show that Claudia Sheinbaum will easily win the election in a massive landslide. Every poll shows her at 53% support, or some even more, whereas the second place candidate, who represents the oligarchy, the right wing in Mexico, all of the different neoliberal parties combined together, including the PAN.
It's crazy America has more fire for AMLO than Modi. That's not crazy at all. What are you talking about? Modi's a fucking fascist. Also, you know, cleaning up the Muslim influence in his country, and is also aligned with the Western, aligned with Western interests. and not very fond of China. He's perfect for America. Why the fuck would they ever criticize Modi? Modi does literally all the things that our media says whoever the fuck is like ostensibly, not even like full-blown leftist, but like even marginally leftist is doing.
On the PRI, even the former Social Democratic Party, the PRD, that became a right-wing party, all of the right-wing combined together behind the candidate Xochitl Galvez, and she still only has 30% support, despite the fact that all of the major media outlets support her, which all are owned by the oligarchs. All of the major right-wing parties are behind her. The US government is behind her. And yet, clearly, the Mexican people support the left-wing Morena party of AMLO and the candidate Claudia Sheinbaum, who, by the way, is a scientist with a...
Bro, I don't like India, but they're not aligned with the West. Why? Because they're a mediator for like Russian oil and gas? Is that what it is? Is that why they're not aligned with the West entirely? Because they get to make a pretty penny?
The PhD in energy engineering. She's an expert on climate change and sustainable development. Again, she was the governor of Mexico City. So this is what actual democracy looks like. But instead, the US government has been spreading this false narrative that supposedly AMLO is threatening democracy. In fact, just a few days before the election, on the 31st of May, the Washington think tank CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is a neoconservative think tank funded by the US government, funded by US allies, funded by the weapons industry, the military-industrial complex. CSIS published this ridiculous report titled An Uncertain Future, Democratic Backsliding Through Executive...
Chatters be like, how can you say India's aligned with the West? They executed people on Canadian soil, which would mean that Saudi Arabia is not aligned with the West, or Israel's not aligned with the West either. If that's your metric for being not aligned with the West, even Israel, Israel's another great country that is a great... has a lot of parallels here with India in terms of like their allegiance with Russia, for example. Would you ever say Israel is not aligned with the West? You're adding Aruna? No.
Aggrandizement under AMLO. So the US government and the media outlets it funds and the think tanks it funds have been spreading this narrative that AMLO is supposedly threatening democracy. But in reality, polls of actual people in Mexico show the exact opposite. AMLO is the most popular leader in modern history in Mexico with 80% approval. And I want to go back briefly to this poll that was published by Gallup, because it showed that under President AMLO, who entered office in 2018, the presidential terms in Mexico are 6 years. What we've seen is the exact opposite of democratic backsliding. Instead, Mexico has become more democratic. Under President AMLO, we've seen that Mexicans now 53% approve of their leadership, and 61% have confidence in their national government. When López Obrador came to power in 2018, only 29% had faith in their national government. That is to say that confidence in the government in Mexico has doubled under President AMLO. And you know what confidence in the US government is? 30%. And yet the US government claims to be the beacon of democracy and claims that Mexico supposedly is undergoing democratic backsliding. But quite literally, it is the exact opposite. Mexico is becoming more democratic under AMLO and the left-wing Morena party, whereas the US is becoming less democratic. According to the latest polls, what is Joe Biden's approval? 39%. Only
Mexico is really interesting in the Israel conversation, which he's not bringing up, and Motorface wants me to fucking talk about AMLO, but like AMLO's personal position on Israel is different than the Mexican administration's position, it seems. Here's a Al Jazeera article on it. Mexico's election puts López Obrador's stance on Israel under microscope. As President López Obrador's tenure ends, advocates reflect on his reticence to speak out against Israel's war in Gaza. On Tuesday, the International Court of Justice announced that Mexico had requested to join South Africa's case accusing the Israeli government of committing genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza. But the very next day, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, known as AMLO, refused to define Israel's actions as genocide. We don't want to put ourselves into a definition of this type that, instead of resolving a conflict, aggravates it. Now, I wonder why he would say that. Perhaps it might have something to do with the one export of Israel that, as far as I understand, the Mexican government has used. And I'm not talking about motherfucking ways, nor am I talking about shitty techno music. He's Jewish? What? No, what are you guys saying? What is happening here? And no, I'm not talking about motherfucking hummus either, bro. What? No, it's surveillance. It's Pegasus. It was the latest evidence that López Obrador's ambiguous, somewhat contradictory stance towards Israel and its war in Gaza, which is nearing its 8th month. Yeah, 22% of weapons dealers to the Mexican army and most of the intelligence tech. Chad said he's Jewish is insane. Yeah. Claudia, that's running, is Jewish, which is why a lot of people are saying that, I think, maybe, because they're stupid and they listen to like these engagement farming Twitter accounts that will literally be like, the next Mexican president is Jewish. And it's like, I don't know what her stance is on Israel, but I'm not immediately going to fucking be like, well, because she's Jewish, she must be a fucking unconditional dick rider of Israel, because I'm not a dumb fuck, especially considering that her grandfather was a literal fucking communist and half of the Mexican right are literally calling her Stalin, like woman Stalin. And that doesn't mean she actually is, by the way. The one thing she is a major AMLO dick rider, from what I understand. This Sunday, Mexico holds its largest election in history with every seat in Congress and the presidency at stake. The vote is considered a referendum on López Obrador's outgoing administration, which enjoyed high popularity during his 6 years in office. But critics have questioned what the legacy of his foreign policy will be and whether his likely successor, Morena Party candidate Claudia Sheinbaum, will carry on his ambivalent relationship towards Israel. Bucking the pink tide, the left-leaning López Obrador was elected in 2018 amid a tide of discontent. Voters rejected the governing Institutional Revolutionary Party in a landslide, leading to a historic margin of victory for López Obrador and his Morena Party. His election heralded a period of equally historic wins for left-leaning leaders across Latin America. In the years that followed, Chile elected progressive Gabriel Boric, Mr. Podcaster himself, its youngest president ever. In Colombia, meanwhile, Gustavo Petro became the first left-wing leader to win the modern presidency. And in Brazil, the prominent left-wing leader, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, the GOAT, nabbed his third term in office after a gap of more than a decade. Critics have dubbed the election streak as the new pink tide, ushering in a generation of like-minded leaders. But when it comes to Israel, Mexico's López Obrador has broken this mold. After the war erupted on October 7, much of the so-called pink tide spoke out against the spiraling death toll in Gaza. Boric condemned Israel's military offensive as disproportionate. Others went further. Lula recalled Brazil's ambassador because he's the GOAT on Wednesday, and Petro cut diplomatic ties altogether in May. Also the GOAT. I think another thing that Petro did, the previous administration had, I think, hold on, I want to look this up. I remember reading something about how Gustavo Petro literally was personally victim to, or at least his comrades were literally personally victim to the former Cuban administration utilizing Israeli surveillance technology on them. And he is now punishing people that used it. Hold on. Dude, this is awesome. Look. Foundation. Well, that's a leader in the pink tide that actually did take a pretty fucking hard stance against Israel. AMLO, on the other hand, did not. It might have something to do with the surveillance technology and the weapons that they get from Israel. That's all I'm saying. You see what I mean? how Mexico became the biggest user of the world's most notorious spy tool. A Times investigation reveals the story behind how Mexico became the first and most prolific user of Pegasus. It's still using it despite promising to stop. This is what I was talking about. However, their ally Mexico has not followed suit in the full-throated criticism. Observers have said López Obrador has instead sought to strike a middle ground, a stance that has failed to please both Israeli officials and Palestinian rights supporters. On October 9, for instance, the Mexican president offered his support to Israel, but refused to condone the violence unfolding against Palestinians in Gaza. We respect the Israeli government and even more the Israeli people, he said. Mexico does not want war. We are pacifists, and we do not want anyone to lose their lives, whether they be Israeli or Palestinian. That equivocation earned a furious response from Israel's ambassador to Mexico. I remember this. Anot Kronzneiger, who retorted in a media interview, not taking sides is supporting terror. López Obrador also faced pressure from the Palestinian advocates. Still, a few weeks later, he doubled down, ruling out any possibility of taking a firm stance. We, and I want to be very clear when I say this, are not going to break relations with Israel or take a position beyond calling for peace. It's fascinating that AMLO is still using Pegasus since it was literally used against him and his wife. Yeah, well, I didn't know about that, but I will tell you this much. Okay? He knows it works really fucking well. So if he was victim to it, then he's like, damn, this shit is awesome. We should use this ourselves. He probably uses it now. No, he definitely uses it now, like very openly. That's not a question. A response rooted in contradiction. Tamaris Greco, a journalist covering the war in Gaza, has spent 2 decades reporting on the Middle East for the Mexican newspaper Milenio and other publications. He has to notice the more muted reaction for the normally outspoken López Obrador. The pace has been really slow. I wonder why. Greco was on the ground in West Bank. Israel's month-long counteroffensive, however, has killed more than 36,000 Palestinians. In Greco's opinion, Mexico's reticence to join the other left-leaning governments in condemning Israel hints at the weight of the military and commercial contracts between the two countries. There you go. Always the public position of Mexico has been in favor of Palestine, but there's a contradiction, Greco said, pointing out to Mexico's economic and military interests. Hey, maybe he used the Pegasus to find the elves. That's not what Pegasus does. Unless the elves are using iPhones. I don't know if Pegasus is going to be able to fucking What the fuck are we doing? Okay. That's why I said the position of the Mexican government is different than like AMLO's wishy-washy approach to it. AMLO expanded the military's role significantly, and that includes spying. His party blocked investigations into abuses too, yes. And also there are massive social issues in Mexico, like femicide. Okay? That shit is crazy. Obviously, there's cartel violence. I don't know how to solve any of that other than like America legalizing drugs and also illegalizing weapon shipments as payment for drugs. That would be a pretty good solution. Femicide. Femicide is genocide of women. Here, let's give you some facts about femicide in Mexico. Mexico officially began documenting the amount of femicide occurrences in 2012. The country's femicide rate exceeded more than 1,000 femicides in the year 2021. Out of 3,400 women victims and out of 34,000 overall victims, so roughly 3% of the victims. The intentional killing with a gender-related motivation is what femicide is. Femicide may be driven by stereotype gender roles, discrimination towards women and girls, unequal power relationships between women and men, and harmful societal norms. Also, violence against journalists is a big problem. Oh, yeah. I mean, but that's like... It's not genocide, it's homicide version with a feminine now. Sorry. Instead of homicide is so homicide is the genocide, homicide. Yeah, it's gay.
Of people in the US.
Anyway, he's not going to bring all that stuff up, obviously, because he's doing the thing that some people sometimes do, which is critical support for leader A means uncritical support, actually.
Support Joe Biden. AMLO is literally twice as popular as Biden. Meanwhile, 56% of North Americans disapprove of Biden. And what was Donald Trump's approval in his last year in office in 2020? Right now, it's June 2024. Well, 4 years ago, in June 2020, Donald Trump's approval rating was 38%. His disapproval rating was 57%. Basically, exactly the same.
He looks like if David Pacman was a priest. Listen, I'm not going to talk shit about Ben Norton. Because, wait, he's the one who is now in China, right? Like, he went to China. He's living the dream. Okay? He's not in the gray zone anymore. He left gray zone. There was a lot of drama. Him and Max Blumenthal broke up. Now Max also was going down this like insane route, to be fair. I think Ben left because of in a lot of instances Max Blumenthal going down insane pipelines. The Israel-Palestine stuff is like brought back Max Blumenthal in a big way. As long as he's not talking about fucking, yeah, just only listen to him about Palestine. He does good reporting there. But beyond that, it's leaves much to be desired.
As Biden. So AMLO is twice as popular as Trump was at this point in his presidency and as Biden is. And yet US government funded think tanks in Washington like the Wilson Center, another one of these neoconservative groups, they have also published these articles.
Yes, this is also true. There's a really funny video of this. I think I watched this on stream. Max Blumenthal literally tracked Ben Norton down in South America and yelled at him on a bus.
Was complaining about so-called democratic backsliding in Mexico, lessons for opponents of authoritarian populism. Apparently, authoritarian populism is when President AMLO has 80% approval. Now, earlier I explained why AMLO is so popular, and I mentioned that one of the reasons is simply because he has significantly helped poor people, and his famous slogan is, "First the poor. Primero los pobres." He's always tried to raise the living standards of working class people in Mexico. I want to look at some of the data here because it speaks for itself. The change in the real minimum wage in Mexico under President AMLO, it has increased by 84%. Between 2018 and 2023, the minimum wage in Mexico has increased more than any other country in Latin America by far, 84%. However, that was just the minimum wage. Let's also look at the data on per capita real labor income. So this is per capita. So this is all of the labor income of the country divided by the population per person. And you can see that in 2018, when AMLO came into office, the per capita real labor income was about 2,500 Mexican pesos per trimester. and that has massively increased. It had been stagnant for a decade. In fact, some years it decreased, especially in the neoliberal right-wing governments. And then when AMLO came in, it significantly started increasing. It did fall during the pandemic, but after 2020, it increased, and then significantly after recovering, it significantly increased further, and is now at around 3,150, 3,200 Mexican pesos per trimester. So this is a significant increase for the average worker in Mexico. And by the way, this is the real increase. It takes into account inflation. So it's not that all of this is because inflation has been high in recent years. These are real increases in per capita labor income. At the same time, there has also been a significant decrease in poverty in Mexico. Now, for decades, poverty has been a very serious systemic problem in Mexico. So the numbers are still high, but they've dropped dramatically. In 2018, when AMLO came in, the poverty rate was 50%, half the population. And then because of the pandemic, that figure increased to 53%.
Thoughts on Nayib Bukele? No. Just no. That's all I'm going to say. No. Okay. All you need to know about Nayib Bukele is he's like talking at fucking CPAC and shit. Okay.
3%. But from the end of the pandemic until 2022, it fell by 10 points and is now at 44%. And the extreme poverty rate has fallen from 17% during the pandemic to 12% as of 2022. And this is data from 2 years ago.
We're talking about Latin American rights, not Latin American wrongs, okay? We're talking about pink tide shit. We're not talking about psychos today.
The number has continued decreasing since then. So obviously poverty is still a very real concern in Mexico, and this is why in the election it is basically guaranteed that the left-wing candidate Claudia Sheinbaum will win. All of the polls show her with 53% support. She is from the same left-wing party as AMLO, Morena, and she has pledged to continue AMLO's campaign of fighting poverty and reducing inequality. And going back to the Gallup poll with which I began this analysis today, it also asked Mexicans what they feel about the future of their economy. And for the first time ever since Gallup started studying Mexico's economy and interviewing Mexicans, for the first time, a majority of people in Mexico are optimistic about the future of their economy. 73% say that their living standards are getting better. 3/4 of Mexicans say their living standards are getting better. 57%, a slight majority, say that the local economy is getting better. This is higher than Gallup has ever seen in its polls. For the first time on record, 55% of Mexicans have confidence in Mexico's financial institutions and banks. And the poll noted that in Mexico, people feel more positive about their economic future in 2023 than almost any other advanced economy, including the US, where people are rightfully very pessimistic about their economic future. In fact, in the US, it's the polar inversion of what's happening in Mexico. According to Gallup, 70% of people in the US say the economy is getting worse. Only 26% say the economy is getting better. So quite literally in Mexico, twice as many people think the economy is getting better in Mexico than in the US. Just as AMLO is twice as popular as Biden is or as Trump was in his same time in his presidential administration. So this is scientific proof. Looking at polling done by a US polling firm. This is not done by a Mexican polling firm that is linked to President AMLO and his left-wing Morena party. This is according to scientific polling done by Gallup, the leading US firm. And they acknowledge that Mexico is twice as democratic as the US, and twice as many people in Mexico are optimistic about their economy as in the US. So the conclusion here is that Mexico, its system, despite the many problems that do exist, the violence, the poverty that still exists, despite all of that, Mexico's system is working better for the people of Mexico than it is for the US. And it's genuinely more democratic, despite the fact that the US government has spent years and millions of dollars trying to convince people that Mexico is supposedly becoming authoritarian.
When you say in America, Hispanics love social programs, Mexico only proves your point even more. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of poverty in Latin American countries, and you either have most of the Latin American population that stays behind in their respective nations that like absolutely are ride or die for the government fixing the situation, or the ones that do come oftentimes to the United States of America that are escaping either some kind of repression from the government or the violence in general that still firmly believe that the government could solve issues. The ones that don't feel that way are oftentimes political asylum seekers.
Under the,
like, you know, from Venezuela, from Cuba.
Left-wing socialist populist AMLO, who's going to be the new Venezuela, and he's going to be the next Hugo Chavez. In fact, ironically, President AMLO himself has called out the U.S. for this double standard. The U.S.
Aren't a lot of pro-America Latin countries improving rapidly? What? What does this even mean? What kind of What about Javier Milei? He seems very popular and pro-America. Yeah. When I think of countries that are rapidly improving, that are pro-America in Latin America, I think of Argentina and El Salvador. Okay, this chatter is probably just asking, you know, in a not in like an annoying way. I hope. You just hate brave Argentinian men doing good for their country. It's true.
State Department has repeatedly meddled in Mexico's internal affairs, claiming that AMLO is supposedly undermining democracy. And AMLO responded by condemning the U.S. and saying that Mexico is more democratic than the U.S. and saying the U.S. is an oligarchy. And of course, the polling shows that he's correct. In fact, when the Biden administration held democracy last year, AMLO called out the U.S. directly to its face, saying that it's an oligarchy posing as a democracy. Repeatedly during his term, AMLO has sent letters to the U.S. criticizing it for funding right-wing opposition groups who have been protesting Mexico's elected government and trying to destabilize it. AMLO has also been very outspoken in support of Julian Assange, the journalist and political prisoner, whom the U.S. is trying to throw in prison for the rest of his life for the so-called crime of doing journalism. AMLO referred to Julian Assange as a prisoner of conscience and, quote, the best journalist of our time. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the...
Okay, this is just padding. This is just padding. Like, that's what it is. This is leftist padding.
Main reasons that the U.S. government and corporate media outlets have spread these lies claiming that AMLO is authoritarian and undermining democracy is because he's not a U.S. puppet. On the contrary, AMLO has had an independent foreign policy, and he has been supportive of Cuba, condemning...
I can't trust anyone living in China, bro. What the fuck do you mean? That's why you should trust him more, in my opinion. The man's living the fucking dream, dude. I mean, he is glazing though, for sure. This is glaze. This is like Krispy Kreme glazed donut type shit.
The illegal U.S. blockade of Cuba and condemning neoliberal orthodoxy that right-wing economists have tried to force down the throats of developing countries for decades. Back in 2022, AMLO denounced the illegal U.S. blockade of Cuba as, quote, a tremendous violation of human rights. He has been very outspoken on this issue, which has angered the imperial overlords in Washington. So this is the reality of what's happening in Mexico. AMLO is one of the most popular leaders in the world. Do not believe this nonsense propaganda you see in the Western media. And now you can understand why the U.S. government and right-wing oligarchs in Mexico have been spreading this narrative. And you can understand why Claudia Sheinbaum is going to win the election and be the first ever female president in Mexico and a left-wing president who will continue many of these policies of nationalizing the natural resources, increasing the minimum wage, raising living standards, and resisting the oligarchy in Mexico, whose loyalties are not to the Mexican people, certainly not to the Mexican working class. Their loyalties are to the U.S. empire, and Wall Street.
Yeah, AMLO's definitely operating alongside U.S. interests, but many people in the chat will say, oh, well, what is he supposed to do? He'll get destroyed if he doesn't. When it comes to American immigration policy.